Welcome. Some days I want to start a barbershop quartet with myself, but I just don't know where to start. I don't know who to talk to. Give me all your hot barbershop quartet leads. I want them. Thank you. This video is part 2 of a behind the scenes of the short film I shot a little while ago. I shot it a long while ago, but I posted it a few weeks ago. If you haven't seen it, go back and watch it by clicking on a link here. There will be a link at the end for the first behind the scenes, and this is the second behind the scenes. This is talking a bit more about post-production. At the end of the last video, I mentioned how I felt great leaving set, but as soon as I started to edit, I hated what I was seeing, which is apparently common, and I am definitely a part of that club. I don't want to be, but I am. So I put the short on a shelf for a little while, but the guilt of knowing how many people helped me out, how many people gave me their time, made me, for better or for worse, have to finish this. So our post-production story starts today in what's called the offline edit. And it's not about color correction at all or any of that stuff. It's about story, timing, and edit. One of the first problems I ran into was I had our hero, our guy, Andy, smoking. I thought he would be like some romantic 1950s beat poet writer type, which would come across ironically as the story progresses. But watching it in the edit, I just didn't like it, even when it's ironic. So the first thing I had to do was cut around the smoking. I never shot any intro scenes without a cigarette. So the only solve I could find is using one of the shots that's from the ending, if I reversed it. When you reverse a shot, you can sometimes get away with it, but usually the momentum of people's gestures and movements are a little bit off, and you can tell in this case, but it was subtle enough that no one's noticed so far. Unless they all have noticed and no one's telling me, and everyone is talking about this behind my back. The internet is all abuzz with my failure. The next problem is that these shots at the end were sort of dulling out. It's sort of like a release of tension in the story. And to get into the story, I would have preferred a dolly in on our guy. So I ended up putting a fake post zoom on, which is just zooming in on your footage, and that was laid over a dolly out. So what it ended up having is a little bit of a Vertigo or Jaws sort of effect to it, which kind of worked for this story. It's just one of those coincidences that it happened to work. Otherwise, it might have looked a bit weird, what you would call unmotivated. You want the camera to always serve the story. You don't want it to be flying around willy-nilly. Once I got the intro working, there was only really one other thing, and every time I watched the edit, a shot I didn't have played in my head, and it was of a clock doing a time lapse spinning around. In order to get it out of my head, I just had to shoot it. I had a clock. I didn't want to shoot it in time lapse, kind of because the clock didn't work, but also because if you shoot it in time lapse as the hands spin, there's no motion blur. It looks like a time lapse, which I guess it should look like a time lapse, but I wanted motion blur on the hands, whatever. I wanted motion blur on the hands. The other problem was when you adjust the clock, the second hand doesn't move. So I took the second hand out. So I set up a small set in my basement with my friend Drew, who's been helping me with a lot of film projects. And I got my time-lapse shot with his help. While we were shooting this, I jumped ahead a bit, and we got all the screen replacement shots I knew we'd need. Even though my mini electrical engineer son got the old compact computer running, he couldn't get it to fully boot up, so we had to do screen replacements. I did some research on period correct writing software and created a WordStar lookalike in Photoshop. I hooked an old tube TV up to my MacBook as a second monitor through one of my fancy AV converters. letting me film the opening credits, all of the screens for replacement right off of an old screen. I think it made it look really legit, rather than wasting a lot of time trying to figure out half-baked After Effects, old CRT looking stuff. I really like doing things practically. One of the really bright spots was music. When we were filming this, a piece of direction I gave to Andy, our actor, was to almost imagine he's like a jazz musician, lost in the moment. And every time we were filming, all I could hear in my head was a jazz drum solo. So I listened to a bunch of jazz stock drum tracks and nothing quite worked. So I reached out to a friend, Glenn, who's a great drummer and a drum teacher, and I asked him if he'd be interested in helping out. He was very excited about actually scoring something to picture. To start, I made him a version of the edit with no music but a click track. We picked a tempo and I put a click track or a metronome down for him. And then he took that away and did music notation with the drums, which is wild. I've never seen drum notation. But just something really simple so that as he went through the beats of the story, he could start to interpret it with his drumming. There's some really nice moments in his track that really help lift the story up. We recorded in a cool little rehearsal space in the city and ran about 15 takes with little adjustments here and there until we were hitting the story beats perfectly. Glenn's friend Matt engineered the session and passed the files off to me, and I picked what I thought was the best take and sent them off to my mixer, David. He did all of the sound design, little things like the intro, how it's over the sound of an old hard drive booting up. Those are all David's ideas. And at the end of the mix, I had my first custom score. I was very, very happy. So while the audio was out getting mixed with David, that's when I took the screen replacements that I'd filmed earlier and started putting them in. I'm okay in After Effects, but I feel like I'm just like barely holding it together. So for some of the more complicated tracks in this, where there's quite a bit of dynamic camera movement and foreground, I asked a friend, Brett, who's another director repped by the same production company as me. He is a true Renaissance man. He directs, DPs, edits, does all the VFX and colors his work. Very talented guy. He was happy to help me out just with some of the trickier tracks. Color is another thing where I feel like I'm at the complete basic level. I don't have any nuanced skill in it. I can make things start to look stylized in a certain way, but it doesn't have the depth of good color grading that I see in a lot of other people's work. I wanted to reach out for some help on this, but I also just wanted it done. So I sort of decided to dive in. I'm not super proud of it. I just needed this short out of my life and posted. I think this will be the last short film that I grade myself. It's one of those things that is worth investing in. With every short that I do, I want to have goals. I want to learn something. The goals in this one were simple. It was to tell a story, to set a scene, and to land a joke. I look back at this and I'm very happy. And so when it comes to things I'm not happy with this, like the color grade, the thing that makes me feel better at the end of the day, sure, there are a lot of people who will notice the nuance of a phenomenal color grade, but the vast majority of people just want to laugh rather than never have it released out of being disappointed that it's not perfect. I'm trying to tell myself that it's okay to put imperfect stuff out there as long as you're trying to improve. At a certain point, you just got to put it out there. You just got to get it done. You just got to go for it. And then you need to ungo for it. And then you got to go for it again, and then ungo for it, and then talk yourself into going for it. Thanks for watching. See you later. Welcome.